with our last session of the day, we have the fourth estate. The folks that tell us what's going on, help us interpret what's going on. And we have a great panel today. And I would encourage you all that if you have not, is to check out the local Views of the News show that the University of Missouri and some of its folks put on a regular basis. It's very interesting to see them analyze and address what's going on. I hope I'm not stealing any of your thunder if you're going to talk about it. Definitely, but it's definitely entertaining and gives you some insight on what's going on. It's not all about energy, but it is definitely an insight into what the media is. So with us today, we have three folks that deal with the media. First off, we have in the middle, we have Ken with Energy News Network and the Fresh Energy News. And the far end in yellow is Sara Shipley Hiles, who is with the Missouri River Ag or Missouri River Basin Ag and Water Desk, also teaches here at the University of Missouri. And then finally, on the far right, on my right, is Jeffrey Tomich with Energy E&E News, which is Energy and Environment News. You may know him from his time at the Post-Dispatch as well. So this is just a fireside chat. They're going to talk about all this stuff. At some point, they'll let you all know when questions are available, and they're willing to take those. But we're going to pull back the curtain, and Sarah, I give it to you.
Hey, thank you so much. So hello, we're going to do a little additional introduction of ourselves so that you can understand our backgrounds a little bit more. So again, my name is Sara Shipley Hiles. I'm a faculty member here in the journalism school, and I've been here for 13 years on the faculty. I teach writing, reporting, digital journalism, social media, all the things that you need to do these days to be a journalist, fact verification, visuals, investigation, everything. In addition, I have this project called the Mississippi River Basin Ag and Water Desk, which is the world's longest title for a newsroom ever. And we are a regional reporting collaborative that covers the Mississippi River Basin. And if you're not familiar with what the Mississippi River Basin is, it is the entire drainage of the Mississippi River, which goes from Canada to Louisiana and from Montana over to Pennsylvania. So we're talking a very large area. And we cover agriculture, water, energy, climate, any kind of environmental issue. And we have reporters stationed throughout that region to cover those stories. So it's been a real blast for me to get to work on that and to increase the number of reporters who are covering these issues throughout the region. And we're going to talk a little bit more later about the state of the news media and why such a thing would be necessary in the first place. But that's a little bit about me. I do live here in Columbia. And I think we're going to have a really good time today. We've been hanging out and having fun chatting to get ready for this panel. So let's hear a little bit more from each of you.
Hi, my name is Ken Paulman. I'm the director of the Energy News Network. We're a nonprofit news and information service that covers the transition to a clean energy economy. We're based at Fresh Energy, which is a 501c3 clean energy advocacy organization based in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is where I live. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Josh, for the invite. We are kind of we operate a little bit like a trade publication. You all are really our core audience, the people who are deeply involved with this work. I know many of you already subscribe to our newsletters that I've talked to, so thank you. If you're not already, we have five daily news aggregation newsletters that are free, and then one weekly. You can go to our site at energynews.us to sign up.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Tomich. I am a Midwest-based reporter for E&E News. We are owned by Politico. We're an online subscription news site.
I'll take that one.
I'll start over. My name is Jeff Tomich. I'm a reporter for E&E News. I'm based out of St. Louis. And we are an online subscription news site covering energy and environmental policy. I cover about 10 states, going from Ohio over to Kansas, up to North Dakota, and then Missouri. I like to say we sort of try to cover the the mashup of politics, policy, business, and regulation. Before that, I was at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I covered energy among my beats, and prior to that, I worked for Bloomberg News.
Okay, thanks, everybody. So what I want to talk about first is sort of the media landscape at large. And you've heard us describe, the different outlets that we're working with and the different models. So I want to get into that a little bit more. And first, introduce to the audience the concept of a news desert. So I don't know if this is a familiar term to people here, but you might have heard of the term food desert. And that a food desert is a place that doesn't have maybe a grocery store or an adequate source of food for people. So they're going to be always scrounging and always lacking in nutrition, especially healthy local nutrition, not like you would buy at a convenience store, some kind of energy drink and a granola bar, real, sustainable, and fresh food. And the same concept can be applied to journalism and to the media. Over the past 10 to 15 years, our news model has completely blown up, with the rise of the internet. We can't sell ads like we used to, so everything is different. And my panelists are going to talk a little bit more about that. But this concept called a news desert has come about to explain what we mean. And there are now thousands of places in the United States that can be considered news deserts that maybe once had some kind of local media outlet, maybe a daily or a weekly newspaper, some kind of radio station, and those things have closed. We're seeing generational, turnover. We are seeing these small businesses go out of business. They can't sustain themselves anymore, and the business model is completely changing. So one thing that my media organization is doing to address this is to create more jobs, specifically covering environmental issues. We are grant funded at the Ag and Water Desk, so we have philanthropy behind us, and that is a rising model for news. And so we're trying to put more reporters out into the world covering these issues to, basically fill and flood these news deserts. But from a research perspective, what we know about news deserts generally is that when we have lack of coverage, we see a marked change in the social fabric. So we actually see that local corruption increases when no one is minding and paying attention to what's going on. We see that polarization increases because people don't have like a local source of information and they tend to go to these polarized, national sources or social media. So it's a real problem for society and for democracy when we don't have journalism. So I would encourage you to think about the media maybe in a little bit different way and think about how it contributes to the social fabric, especially within communities. But I would like for the two of you to address this a little bit now too. And Ken, if you could kind of talk about the rise of nonprofit media and how that's different from what we had before. And then Jeff, I'd like you to talk about the subscription model and what that's like.
Yeah, and this will get less dour as we go on, but it's really important to understand this context. All three of us are refugees of the heyday of the newspaper business. I came over to the nonprofit side in 2009, right after the paper I worked at in Spokane, Washington, laid off a quarter of the newsroom, including all of my features staff. I was a features editor at the time, and I said, I'm not doing this anymore. You fired all my reporters. I can't put a section out. Good luck. More complicated story than that. But, and I think it's important to remember that newspapers were never in the journalism business. They were in the advertising business. They were an advertising vehicle. The bulk of their revenue came from three places: classifieds, real estate, and cars. And when you think about those of us who can still remember the time, if you wanted to sell something in newspaper classifieds, it was like $30 to buy a classified ad, right? If you had a set of tires you're trying to get rid of, you're not going to do that now. That's insane. And real estate, you're going to look online for free. If you want to buy a car, there's dozens of free sites to list cars for sale. And so that is really where the collapse happened. Subscriptions never made up a significant portion of revenue for newspapers. They often maybe broke even on the printing process if they were doing really well. And so this idea that, so what comes along to fill that gap? In our case, one of the things that, of course, went away as newspapers were scaling back was coverage of really detailed, nuanced, complicated energy stories. And we at Fresh Energy, I was originally brought on to start an aggregation service called Midwest Energy News. This was back in 2009. Some people still call it that, which I think is really funny and kind of great. Um, and quickly realized that there were so many gaps in coverage, and we were able to convince the foundations that funded Fresh Energy's media work at the time to let me hire reporters and put freelance reporters on certain stories, and that just started to build over time. This money comes from climate programs at foundations like Joyce and the George Gunn Foundation in Ohio, and McKnight and MacArthur. These are not secrets. This is on our website. And we deliver back, a certain number of stories, and we try to measure and show the impact from reporting those stories. But the reality is that this work is difficult and it's expensive. It requires paying people for their time, and I don't know if people really understand how much work goes into it, and the fact that someone's got to pay for it. If it's not advertisers, if it's not readers, then it's going to be philanthropy or some other mystery source. And so we are able to make all of our stuff free because of that foundation support. So you don't get a paywall, you don't have to log in, you see very little ads. But I think sometimes people get upset when they see paywalls and ads and things like that. But that's just another way of paying for the news, which I think Jeff could talk a little bit about how E&E does.
Yeah, so we're very different. As I said, we're a subscription-based site. We are owned by Politico. We were acquired a few years ago. And we were founded and we are based in Washington, D.C. We started actually as a newsletter covering Capitol Hill in the mid-90s, a literal paper newsletter that sort of evolved over the years and went solely online long before I got there. So from that evolved, because I think there was, and this is even before newspapers started running into trouble, but there was just an increasing appetite for information on energy and environmental policy. And this was focused in Washington. And I think partly because of what happened with local media is why they expanded. And I started there in 2014. We have several publications. We have a Climate Wire publication that's dedicated strictly to climate policy and politics. We have Green Wire, which is more general environmental policy. And I work for primarily a publication called Energy Wire, and we write about energy policy. And we expanded to cover regions of the country like the Midwest and the Southeast, specifically because a lot of the news coverage of what was going on, and at the time, 10 years ago, the big story was, could the industrial Midwest transition away from coal? I think that's changing. It's changed quite a bit over the past decade. But there are a lot of people who, professionals, and our subscribers run the gamut. We'd like to say the short answer is they range from Exxon to Greenpeace. So it's everybody, but it's Hill staffers, it's attorneys, it's people in the regulatory world, it's utilities, and they're very interested in not only what's going on in the states and state policy, but how that meshes with federal policy. And there's just, I think, a growing appetite, especially now, to understand what's going on, not only related to the energy transition, but I was thinking the last 6 months, and I was interested listening to the talk about energy efficiency, because the thing that's consumed the energy news world over the past 6 months is people grappling with, oh my gosh, how are we going to handle all the demand, specifically coming from data centers? I mean, it's just like staggering. And grid operators, regulators, utilities, I think, are all trying to get their arms around what's coming and how real is it and what does it mean. So now more than ever, we need coverage of issues, and the newspapers just don't have the staffing and the readership to do that anymore.
Yeah, so we've talked about how different the different types of media are. And so when you talk about the media, it's never a monolith, right? So that is a myth right there. You can see that there are so many different kinds of media and they're going to cover things different ways. So can both of you talk a little bit more about like the differences that you see among like how local media might cover something versus regional versus national specialty outlet? And what are some examples that you've seen of how that can be different?
Yeah, we do these daily aggregated reports every single morning, and so we get a really broad sweep of how issues are being covered all around the country. And one of the panels earlier there, Josh asked like, "What's the craziest like claim you've heard about renewable energy?" And I think I could top those with stuff that has actually been published in newspapers and not challenged. My favorite was someone claiming that solar panels are going to suck away all the sunlight and kill all the plants nearby. I wish I was making this up. Um, so I mean, there's that aspect of it, which is kind of absurd and silly, but you know, where where people in the general public, I think, are engaging with clean energy right now is in a lot of these siting conversations that has really dominated this conversation, this conference over the last couple of days, because they're not thinking about broader national policy. They're not thinking about net metering. They're not thinking about our values, or unless they're working on their own house, like all the stuff we were just talking about earlier. Um, and often and people, so there's a lot of different things here. I'm going to try to stay focused. People understand the world through stories, and the stories that most interest us are the ones where there is conflict, right? Like if there's people outside and I all of a sudden take a swing at Jeff and we get into a fight, they're all going to come in here, right? They're not interested in hearing what we have to say about our professions, but if we start going at it with fists, they're going to be in here checking it out. And that's true when you think about the way these solar controversies get covered. It is opponents versus proponents, and often, especially local outlets, get into the stenography mode because they don't want to step on any toes. These are all their neighbors, right, and members of the community. And sometimes those get elevated into broader national political narratives too. And so we have this idea that it's like solar versus farmers right now, and solar is going to eat up all the farmland, but we're not actually talking about like how sprawl threatens farmland, and that's a much bigger threat. Like that's just normal stuff. And so the space we try to occupy with ENN is, first of all, since we're funded by philanthropy, we don't want to replicate what people are already doing. That's not a good use of philanthropy. We want to be doing work that the market would not otherwise support. And so coming in to do those kind of fact check kind of stories and introduce an appropriate level of nuance into the conversation and try to educate people about the policy issues and things like that. You know, our audience are people that are highly engaged, but that also includes journalists. And that includes people who work for more mainstream publications who follow and read our stories as background material for their own coverage. And so that's this unique sort of place we occupy. We're not trying to get big traffic numbers or anything like that. We barely sell any ads. That doesn't make any sense for us. We're trying to do good work and explain things thoroughly. And there's not, unfortunately, much of a commercial market for that these days anymore.
Do you want to go into the Ohio example or do you want to come back to that later?
We can, sure. I mean, a great example of there's a solar siting controversy in Knox County, Ohio, which is just northeast of Columbus. And I don't know what the status of it is right now, but it's very the contours of the debate are very familiar. And what's interesting is that there are two local media outlets that cover that. One of them, the Mount Vernon News, is very much in the tank for the opponents of this solar project. It basically kind of prints their arguments verbatim as news. There's another outlet called Knox Pages that's a little more balanced and more appropriate in their approach. But we had our reporter who lives in Cleveland come down to attend an event that the solar opponents had organized in this big auditorium where they had a whole array of speakers to talk about the evils of solar power. And the developer was not allowed in to ask questions. They came like, they came to participate and they were barred from entering, but they didn't question our reporter when she came in. We were able to generate a series of stories based on what our reporter found out. And this reporter, Kathy Kowalski, helped break the HB6 scandal in Ohio. So she's a very good investigative reporter. That one, the opposition group had connections with the natural gas industry, big surprise. there was a paper that they were promoting, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but that it used misleading information about the economic benefits of this solar project. And that, when we do our impact tracking process, we talk to people in the community about, hey, did this story make a difference? Did it not? And what we heard from people is that the folks that were in favor of the solar project now felt empowered to speak out because they had information to work with. There were farmers who wanted the solar array because they would benefit from it and it would enable them to keep their farms rather than have it getting carved up for suburban sprawl. And they felt like their rights were being trampled on by these people who weren't anywhere near the project, complaining about it was going to, the aesthetic qualities of it. And so we were able to step in and just do good journalism and really affect, not to try to influence the outcome. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure there is a fair and democratic process that is based in fact and reality and not in hysteria. And that is unfortunately, like, that's often the case as these projects are being debated all around the country.
Yeah, it's someone who I try to keep an eye on, at least. It's hard to follow in depth about 10 different states and what's going on with utilities and policy and what have you. I would say that the issue of energy infrastructure siting is probably, if not the biggest, one of the biggest stories of not just the last, say, 10 years, but probably the next 20 or 30. From wind, solar, transmission, carbon pipelines, you name it. And if you've ever, if you haven't, I would recommend looking at the Princeton University Net Zero America study, where they modeled what it's going to take to get to net zero by 2050 in terms of, and they modeled very numerous scenarios and looked at, high electrification, low electrification. But there's some data in there, and there's some charts that show how much wind and solar are going to be necessary to meet those targets. And it's kind of staggering how much, and it's kind of fueling a lot of the debate around land use, which, kind of getting back to Ken's point, needs to happen on a factual basis, because too often it just devolves into hysteria and misinformation. But Sarah, I know we were referencing a story I did a couple of years ago, which I think was really interesting case study in this. In Western Indiana, is a very rural county in Southwest Indiana, and I've covered so many of these debates over whether it's a wind farm or solar farm or transmission line. You have a noisy contingent that doesn't want it, and some people want it, and there's a meeting at the VFW hall and people screaming at each other, and looking at how that gets covered in the local paper. And oftentimes it lacks, important context. And I got wind of a large renewable energy developer that was developing a project in Southwest Indiana. And I knew the public affairs person at this developer, and I reached out, and she kind of walked me through the fact she had gone to their CEO and said, hey, we want to try something really different. And that is really engage the community from the ground up, from the very start. And they had based this on some research that I think it was Berkeley Lab had done some research about, what makes people hesitant to accept wind energy in their community. And so they went in and set up shop and reached out as broadly as they could to the community and said, tell us what you want, tell us what you don't want, what you like, what are your concerns. And they set up this interactive website, and you could go in, and it had wind speeds, it had transmission interconnections, it had, if there were certain, natural or cultural sites that needed to be avoided. And they basically opened up to the community to help design a wind farm. And they were, in addition to the taxes and the landowner payments, there was a profit share It was a small amount, but we're going to share the revenue from the profit with the county, and you guys can set up a board and decide how you want to spend it. And I don't know, this took at least a year. And in the end, they got the door completely shut in their face. People were not interested. They didn't engage. The county board basically told them to go home. And it kind of made me think, what is it going to take? Can these projects only go to communities that want them? And what does that even mean? Because oftentimes, there might be 50, group of 50 or 20 or 10 people who are raising a stink about something, or 2 county commissioners out of 3 that decide to vote it down, and the whole project gets shut down. There was the same developer had a project, a 300 megawatt wind project, turned away, and they were at the stage, they had a purchase power agreement signed, and that got shut down. So it kind of raises the question, how are we going to meet these goals that not only, the federal government, states, governments, utilities have to transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and how are we going to cite all these projects? I think it's going to be a fascinating issue going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to bring up a few points about framing. This is a term that we use in media scholarship, and y'all may have heard of this. And that idea of how we choose to tell the story. So you can imagine walking into a room of people, and you take a picture with a camera, and you're focusing on this group of people over there who have protest signs, and they are angry, they're opposing something. And your camera is turned this way, so that's the picture that gets published. That's the conflict and the focus of the story. But maybe that's a group of 15 people, and maybe back over here, if you turn the camera this way, maybe there's 100 people sitting quietly back here who aren't really saying anything, but maybe they're the ones who are in favor. And so this is an example of media framing, how we choose to tell the story, where we choose to put our focus. Whom are we quoting? Are we framing this as a conflict? Are we framing it as a controversy? How are we choosing to tell this story? And so you see these issues come up a lot. And I think one thing that we all try to do, because we have specialty publications, basically, is to get away from this sort of duality, conflict framing, and we try to bring much more context to the story. So, and that's something that maybe local outlets are not always equipped to do. They may not always have that context. They may not always have, the science journalism background or the business background to be able to get into that more nuanced storytelling. But that can be a pretty big issue, I think in the media coverage, wouldn't you guys say, in terms of like how the story plays out, especially local versus national?
I would say absolutely. And, on top of that, oftentimes, like Sarah said, these reporters, if you're in a rural county and you're covering a debate over a wind farm, they don't have, dedicated energy or environmental reporters who are familiar with this topic, especially if it's a first project of its kind. And the reporter may not have ever covered this. And you're thrown into a pretty hostile environment with people screaming at you for both sides. And then, by the way, we need that story in 2 hours. So figure out how to write that and present that in a fair way in 2 hours, and not be biased in one way or the other. So it's a difficult task. And as we mentioned earlier, a lot of these papers are a shell of their former selves, and they don't have people to do that.
Yeah, and sometimes, I'm thinking back to a story we covered several years ago on a transmission, probably was the CapEx 2020 line, one of the CapEx lines through Minnesota. There was an organic dairy farm, a beloved organic dairy farm, that this line was going to go adjacent to their property. And Minnesota has a law called the buy the farm law, where the utility has to buy the entire property instead of just the land for the corridor. And these farmers were basically raising hell about this project. And one of their concerns was that stray voltage was going to harm their cows. And this was just sort of going into mainstream coverage without much question, because in a way it sort of makes sense. Well, that is a lot of electricity and there's cows nearby. Maybe it would harm the cows. I could see that. But I grew up next door to a coal plant. We had transmission lines everywhere. That was the first I'd ever heard of transmission lines harming cows. Never heard of such a thing. Usually when stray voltage hurts a cow, it's because Farmer Bob did the wiring himself in the milking barn. And so we were actually approached by this farm to do a story about this, and our reporter, who's now my managing editor, dug into their claims and got independent researchers, which is what you're supposed to do. But instead of having 2 hours to work on this story, he had 2 weeks to work on this story. So he could wait for the scientist to call back or check his sources or check his notes and do a really thorough job. And they were pissed at us when the story came out because they thought we were going to just carry water like everybody else did. And what we pointed out was like, actually, no, all these claims don't have any scientific basis whatsoever. And they ended up winning their claim anyway because they shifted their tactic to focus on the aesthetic issue of it, which was in reality, that's the problem. That's the thing people are most worried about. They sort of throw stuff at the wall to see what sticks, but really they don't want to look at the thing. They were able to make a case that having the power line adjacent to the property undermined their branding as a destination sort of heritage farm for visitors, and they were able to win their case and get the farm bought out. So they didn't have to rely on misinformation. But the point being, it's like that story that may not have happened if it wasn't for us taking the time to actually do the story properly instead of just being stenographers and say, well, they said this, Excel says this, and God, who knows what the truth is? Who could possibly figure that out, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think in Missouri, especially Illinois too, I mean, everyone's familiar at this point with the Grain Belt Express line. And I had to last week go look, and I think I did the first story on this project, and I looked, it was May 29th, 2011, and I was working at the Post-Dispatch, and I'd go through the PSC dockets, and I see this, oh, someone wants to build this high voltage direct current transmission line from Southwest Kansas to Indiana. That sounds like news. It's going to go right through Missouri. And so I called this Michael Skelly guy and wrote a story, and I think I had no idea I would still be writing stories about that 13 years later. But such is life in energy journalism. But I went to a lot of the first public meetings on this project. I think there was one in Macon, Missouri, or I forget the town, but it was much like the picture Sarah just painted. There were people just livid, and then you had a couple of company representatives who were like, "Oh my God, what am I going to do here?" And the amount of there really hasn't, at least I didn't see in the public realm, a real, nuanced, calm, factual debate. I mean, it was a lot of, and I don't fault landowners. This was an emotional, I mean, I genuinely saw emotion on people's face that owned a century farm, and they hear this transmission line is going to come through, and there's people bawling their eyes out, standing before the PSC saying, "Don't come through my farm." And there's some really legitimate issues involved, including some of the local people in Missouri that were opposing the line got wind that the developer at the time, Clean Line, had been, I don't know if they presented or attended a conference in Texas on how to do community development around transmission projects. And somebody had nicknamed the panel session, Marketing to Mayberry. And that did not go over well with people in rural Missouri who got wind of this and just thought, well, that's what they think of us. They think we're sort of rubes. And it just kind of set everything off on the wrong foot. But, again, I'll raise my hand. I probably wrote, and I know it irks the developer, like, hey, you're just focusing on, these 10 people who are screaming about all the bad things this project's going to do to their land. And you're not covering the other people that want the project, that want to see the project go forward for all sorts of reasons. And so that's exactly what you're talking about. And I'm probably guilty of having myself and other media doing those stories because that's, that tends to be what gets the attention.
Yeah, and I think we all learn over time, how to do it better. And we can definitely talk in a minute about how we can do better and how you all can help us. But I did want to open it up to questions because we've been talking for a while. So are there any questions from the audience about any questions for us? Stories that you've seen? There's a question over here.
Josh is coming around with the mic there.
Sorry, give me 1 second. Short legs.
You can ask us anything too, by the way. We are fully transparent, at least I am. Nothing to
No
hide,
secret.
so yeah.
You can ask about our media organizations. How can you pitch to us or anything like that if you want?
I was just curious specifically on the work that I do around building decarbonization, how you see that being covered. It's definitely something that for a long time, energy efficiency has been kind of under the radar, but it's now become much more politicized as it gets harder to do the energy work we're trying to do in buildings. And if you've noticed any sort of nuances between the Midwestern sort of approach to building decarbonization versus maybe a lot of the news that I read on the subject is usually national news, and so it doesn't necessarily catch the Midwestern perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think energy efficiency is kind of criminally undercovered, but it's, I'll be honest with you though, it is as a policy issue, it's like at the bottom, and partly because it's just not, it's not exciting. I mean, I look at my, there's so much appetite for hydrogen and direct air capture, and I'm like, yeah, but that's going to do this much of the work, and energy efficiency can do a ton of the work, but it's not getting the coverage. So yeah, I mean, I think that's on us, the journalists, to be able to connect what's happening at the local and state level with the bigger national story.
Yeah, there is, I agree. It is definitely undercovered. There's a lot to it. I mean, weatherizing and energy efficiency are easy for people to understand. There's incentives and things of that nature. So I think that's all fairly straightforward. But when you start to get into issues like building codes, for instance, we've been covering the Builders Association in North Carolina opposing upgrades to efficiency code in that state. And I think there's similar debates all around the country. These are processes that are arcane and they're very opaque, and builders associations have a tremendous amount of power. They flat out make shit up sometimes. And I wish I could just pretend that some of the estimates they throw out are in good faith, but they're not. When we get into equitable decarbonization, that opens up a whole other universe of not just stories, but also challenging the status quo. And this gets into another sort of overarching theme, I think, is that one of the worst biases that I think our profession has is not interrogating the status quo with the same enthusiasm that we interrogate change and new ideas. And that enables structures, that perpetuate inequity, that perpetuate patriarchy. I'm going to go off topic a little bit, but you see where I'm going. So when we're talking about like efficiency upgrades to older housing stock that may be in areas where the homeowners do not have resources, that are in under invested communities. Well, you can't just throw new insulation in the attic, right? If the roof leaks, and you can't just insulate the windows if the frames are rotted. And so there's, in Minnesota, there was recently legislation that will do some of that pre-work to enable people to bring the property up to code before then they can go ahead and proceed with the energy envelope. Because you're not going to tear the house down and build a new one. That's way more expensive. And so those are topics where I think as journalists, it requires us to sort of step into a role that I think maybe is too uncomfortably close to advocacy for some people, but to just make the determination that it is, as we go through this process, that it needs to be done in a way that helps everybody, that everybody is valuable. And if we're not making a brighter future for everyone, then what are we doing?
Yeah, I think those are such valuable comments. And I would agree that, the media has gone through a lot of transition in terms of what we think our job is. Is our job to cover these news developments that are happening, which leads us in the direction of controversy and conflict? Is our job to really think about what's important here, or maybe to look at the science and like what percentage of things need to change and where should I be focusing the bulk of my energy? Maybe that actually is on these so-called less sexy topics that we really need to be paying attention to and to direct the public attention to as well. So some of that is journalists kind of rethinking how they need to do their work and also finding different ways of telling the story that actually are interesting. So let's get into the human aspect of it, or let's get into the science or how things are changing, or who's blocking progress here, who's blocking change, and what are the lobbyists saying and doing to prevent this issue from being put on the agenda. So those are ways in which we could do our job differently that would maybe change the conversation. Any other questions? Aha.
Thank you. I'm Heather Navarro. I'm the director of the Midwest Climate Collaborative. And on that topic, I think we've talked a lot the last couple of days about federal funding and how important the IRA and bill is, and how most people in the United States have no clue what those things are. And so that storytelling, I think, is so important, especially as we're going to have a new round of elected officials. So our communities need to know, our local, state, federally elected officials need to know how these are impacting our communities. And I'm curious how we get those stories out. In my work, I'm connected to those folks who are in local government and nonprofits and who are using these funds, but most of them don't have their own PR departments. They don't have time to go out and tell their stories and promote themselves. And sometimes it's strategically not a good idea to go talk about all the great things you're doing around climate in your local community, honestly. So I am curious, though. I would love to figure out, how can we connect with you all? Like, what do you need? In my head, I've been thinking, I need to put together these great pitches, and I need to collect all this information and put together a profile, and then I'll send it off to some reporters. But do I need to do that, or what would you all like from the folks who are generating these stories? Is it, I'm not on Twitter or X anymore, so like, I'm not going to tag you there. But yeah, just what advice do you have for us?
Yeah, so I think
Stories.
that's a good question. We can each kind of tell you from our own perspectives how to pitch to the media and what that looks like. So I can start with the Ag and Water Desk. So we are a regional collaborative. So the nice thing about that is it's one-stop shopping for the 16 to 20 newsrooms that we work with. And we do work with local newsrooms. So in contrast, we're both regional and local. There's probably a new term I need to invent for regional and local at the same time. Rocal? I don't know. Anyway.
It sings. I like that.
Yeah. So what we try to do is to work with local outlets that already have a local audience, and we try to help them bring a regional or a national story down to the local audience, and sometimes the reverse. So like what's happening locally that actually is a regional or a national story, or it's happening in multiple locations. And that's why I think we kind of need, and we joked about this term, and all of the above, type of media approach, because we do need these specialty outlets, because we need people who have the time and the resources and the, trained and experienced specialty reporters who can put together these in-depth stories. But we still need the local media, because how are you going to communicate what's happening in your community, right? And we need those local journalists to also be trained. So that's one thing that we do, is bring a lot of expertise and training into the newsrooms through that journalist. So if you want to pitch to the Ag and Water Desk, and we do take energy pitches and do energy coverage, there's one email address. It's called info at agwaterdesk.org. And then through that, you will get to our editorial staff and to the entire network of outlets that we have. There's a concept called, localizing a regional story. So let's say that, the IRA is happening. This is going to affect so many communities. Let's drill down into our community and find out what's happening. So if you have those tips for your local news outlet, you can certainly communicate that to them and say, hey, this big national policy, this is how it's affecting us here. People really like to hear about that. And a local reporter would probably be pretty grateful if you would help them connect the dots if they don't have that specialty background. So that would be one way that you can pitch to a local news outlet. And I don't think that you always have to do so much work in packaging everything together. Probably the most important thing that you can do is build a relationship and to, get to know the local media that you want to work with and to show that you are a trustworthy, reliable source of information and that you're not only going to be pushing your organization's viewpoint, that you're like a real human being and that you're willing to be somewhat vulnerable and transparent with them. I mean, of course, you have a job to do, but I think the people who work the media tend to trust are going to be the people who are going to tell it to them straight. So that would be my suggestion is to get to know them and, send things over not only when it only meets, your brand's narrow scope of work, but, helpful suggestions. Let me help you out is going to go a long way for the type of reporters that I'm used to working with. But do you guys want to talk about pitching? How to pitch?
Yeah, I mean, so it's one interesting thing about the way we're structured is I do work in an advocacy organization and I talk to my coworkers and I understand kind of the struggles they have. They're also trying to pitch other media outlets besides us. And the world in which many of you operate, probably most of you, is very quantitative, I think, right? Like you're dealing with metrics, you're dealing with numbers, you're dealing with measurable outcomes, right? This building uses X percent less energy than it did before. The previous session, we were talking about upgrades to schools, and the numbers were all really impressive. So if you're telling me that okay, this school is able to reduce its energy usage by 30%, okay, that's interesting. This school was able to save $1 million over the course of 5 years. That's a little more interesting. You're getting my attention. This school was able to use the money from these efficiency upgrades to hire new teachers. Now you have my attention because this is bringing it home to a more immediate sort of human problem that all of us can relate to. And, you know, I mentioned we understand the world through stories, and stories are more interesting when they have people. We did a piece about a solar job training program in Chicago that focuses on, again, an underinvested community where you have kids who are not planning to go to college. Some of the folks that are being trained are coming out of the justice system. And a reporter got to talk to the people going through this program. And so on one hand, it's like, okay, meeting a need, right? Like the solar industry needs employees, like to help do installations and learn to become electricians, et cetera. But what it means for these folks going through this program is a whole different thing. It is opening up an entire new world for them. And to hear about how this is affecting them and giving them hope and opportunity that they didn't have before, thanks to the the Inflation Reduction Act, um, that's a hell of a good story that we're going to jump on every time. And so, one of my former colleagues used to say the two most important questions that any journalist is going to ask are, how do you know that? And so what? And to me, like the so what is, can you show me like, how is this improving or changing or, affecting people's lives? I think that's really the secret.
Yeah, I would just echo that because I've seen a lot of stories about the 2-year anniversary of the IRA and the money coming out of Washington, and we've covered that story I think a lot from the top down. We had a big series called Biden's Billions about how like the federal government can't shovel money out the door fast enough, for all these programs. But I think what's missing and what makes a story is the the narrative, the example at the local level, whether it's the Afton School District or something in the Twin Cities or Chicago or whatever. But because my eyes, I don't know about everyone else, but my eyes glaze over when I see just these huge figures and talk about federal legislation but what makes it resonate is how it impacts people's lives and just from a storyteller's perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, great. So kind of to facilitate the evolution of the media, or is that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I can answer one way, which is that, we need advocates too in the media. And the media are changing a lot, as we've talked about. So I think one way to do that is to, all of us are operating in different spaces with different funding sources. So like the Ag and Water Desk, we are grant funded, but we also are taking smaller donations. So donating individually is one way to do that, but I think there's a lot of interest now in other models for funding the media, and we didn't talk about this, so I don't know what you guys think about it. But there's even conversation about government funding of media and some of these alternate ways of funding so that we can have a sustainable source. And if you think that good journalism is actually a civic benefit and maybe even a comparable to a utility in some way to have information flow, accurate information flow. So participating in those kinds of conversations in a positive way, and encouraging other people to think that way would be one way of going about it, but I want to hear what y'all have to say on this.
I mean, when I'm thinking like, what can city government do to help us out? One is like transparency and data. And, like Kansas City is doing efficiency benchmarking, right? Like, I don't know if that's the case, but all of that needs to be online, accessible, downloadable, not in like freaking PDFs, like buried somewhere. City websites are generally awful. And we don't know where else to go look for stuff, at least initially. And my dream would be like a city website that has just literally all of the data the city has collected, public, police incident reports, all of that stuff, searchable, easy to download, and so you don't have to be a wizard or know somebody on the inside to go find it. So I don't think that was specifically maybe what your question was asking, but it gets back to like the barrier to good coverage often is time. If it's going to take me 3 days to find the data I need for this story, that's like 2 other stories that I can't get done.
Yeah, I would say the same. I occasionally will deal with a municipality or a county government, but oftentimes they don't know who I am. They're like, Ian who? And so there's, it takes a while to establish those relationships. So I love people to reach out to me and just have a conversation. I know I'm not local media, so there's, a lot of times, folks are going to go to the local newspaper or they want to get story out in their market. I get just peppered by interest groups out of DC. So,
Yeah, and for Kansas City specifically, we have a reporter at Kansas City PBS Flatland. So maybe we can talk about that afterward and sort of how there are local media collaboratives happening and popping up all the time as well. And I think that's a way, if you can tap into that local media collaborative to kind of have more of a conversation, get your message out, get to know each other a little bit, find out what's happening in the local media ecosystem and what they may need, and what their resources they may be short on. Journalists are also now getting into the business of holding events. And I think that's a way in which some cooperation is actually going to be really beneficial. If we can have some kind of understanding and open exchange with government on all levels, that's going to help a lot.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel.